got to a job to do someone's bad patch. As you can tell, it's pretty bad. First thing I like to do is either sand down the patch or scrape it. Scrape down all the heavy stuff. It's really good. This patch right here doesn't look like they used tape on it, so I'm going to have to tape this up before we mud it. We're just basically going to mud out the whole area with 5-minute quick set mud, do 2 or 3 coats, float it out, and then we're going to have to match the skip trail texture. It is a messy job, so I always recommend putting down plastic. But right now I'm going to go out to the truck and I'm going to get the fiberglass and mix up a first coat of mud, and we're going to tape that up and do a nice heavy first coat to float out that ugly patch. An extra minute on it, scraped it out more, got the heavy stuff out. I'm going to fiberglass it right now, but I like to spray some spray glue on it because it is a dusty wall. So I like to put the spray glue on it to help bond it. As you can see, there's a crack here. It's basically a patch that they just put in, and somebody mudded it heavy, and that's all I did. So now we have to refinish it. I like to just spray the seam. That's the tape seam that the tape's going to be at. And then we take our fiberglass roll, and then we just tape over the seams. That glue holds that tape on. The tape naturally has adhesive on it, but it doesn't like to stick to old walls, just new sheetrock. So I like to use this cheap drywall spray glue. Makes an excellent bonder for tape, muds, and everything. It's used mostly for putting on drywall bead. It's a bad patch, so I like to just run. You can just fiberglass over the whole thing. That way, I don't know if they put pieces of drywall in. Most people would think you'd have to cut out this area and replace it, but you don't need to cut out and replace if you know how to mud. I'm going to be using a 5-minute mud, so I'm able to get this first coated, second coated, and textured in one trip. If you're not familiar with working with hot mud, you could use a regular joint compound that you would just coat this, let it dry overnight, then sand it, then coat it, let it dry, sand it, and then slick it out with a wet sponge, then texture. That's usually a 2 or 3 day process, but I'm on a 1-trip job, so I gotta use quick set 5-minute muds. So that's all fiberglass ready for mud. So now I'm gonna go to the truck and I'm gonna mix up a pan of 5-minute mud, and we're gonna put a nice heavy first coat of mud on there. We're gonna let that first coat mud dry, and then come back and slick it out with a wet sponge, then turn around and do the same process with the second coat, let that dry, slick it out, and then it'll be ready for texture. But yeah, let me go mix a pan of mud back in my truck. Basically, I'm gonna mix a little bit of 5-minute mud. If you watch my previous videos, I got bags of 5-minute, which is a preferred material to use on these quick jobs that we have to do first coat, second coat, and turn around and texture in one trip. I like to keep my 5 minutes in buckets with lids, so it keeps it sealed and keeps water out of it and stuff like that. You keep it in a bag, but I prefer the bucket method. So I grab my drywall pan. This is not a fairly large patch, so I'm not gonna use a lot of materials. I just wanna mix, a quarter of a pan, half a pan, small pan of drywall like that. We'll just take a little extra just in case, because I have to float out that patch pretty heavy. You always use fresh water with hot muds. If you use dirty old water, it tends to set up the product faster. So I just put about a sponge and a half of water, and I'm gonna start with that and mix it up. And the consistency we're going through for first coats, just a little thinner than like bread dough. It needs to be a thick, heavy first coat, not watery, not soupy. On this one, I put a little bit of water. Sometimes you can drain off the excess water, or you can just put a little bit more powder. Kind of like making pancakes, but this is going to be definitely thicker than pancake batter. More like in between a pancake and a bread dough thickness. Basically, you want to coat the thing, so you need a nice heavy coat. You don't need to build out the material on the wall really heavy. We're not trying to make a big bulge on the wall. We just got to put the mud to float it out nicely. So once you thoroughly mix this, I usually like to scrape my pan sides, get all that dry formula tossed and turned in there so it's nice and mixed. Once you put the water with the powder, it activates a material in it. That's why it's called quick set materials, because it sets up chemically. And then they usually call it hot muds, because when it does kind of get warm, but it's a chemical reaction that causes this to dry. It's not like a regular joint compound that has to dry overnight. That's a different type of material that just has glues in it. This is an actual quick set hot mud that I'm using. But I like to make sure everything's clean, because I am going into a customer's house and I don't want to be dropping mud everywhere. We like to keep these jobs clean, keep our tools clean, and try to keep it professional. But I'm gonna go inside right now and get ready to do a nice heavy first coat on the patch. This is my pan of 5 minutes, so I gotta work fast before it dries. Back at the patch. So usually you can see on your knife, there's kind of a bow on a knife. It kind of arches. You always want to use that bow on the wall side. Then you control your fingers. Some people think you grab a knife like that, you gotta control it, left, right, left, right. You're kind of steering. I like to feather it. I like to feather that direction, so you put the pressure on the knife. But that just takes many uses. But what I like to do first on all these fiberglass jobs, I like to just strike in the mud, so I know it fills in any gaps, and it really gets in the grooves of things. Once I got it like a pre-fill in it, then I like to coat this patch out nice and heavy, nice and heavy, nice and heavy. I like to just get basically all my materials on, my pan on, and then I can sit around and trowel it down. And this mud does have some clumps in it somehow. But see how I feathered that? I use the corner of the knife and just feather it. Use the corner of the knife, feather it. Corner of the knife, feather it. Corner of the knife, feather it. And usually you can do this method, go down the middle, and then you go to the side, feather it, feather it. Or if you have a big knife, you can use a big knife. But all we're doing right now is we're just trying to get a nice heavy coat on this. So then we're gonna go around and trowel it down. But we're just gonna let that set. Your hot muds, you always dump them out before they dry. If I do dump mud in my workstation, sometimes I like to just toss the plastic over it because I don't want to step in that and then track it in the house. But we're gonna let that dry. It takes about 5-10 minutes. We're gonna check on it in about 5 minutes and see how it's starting to set up. It is a 5-minute mud, so I gotta go wash my tools and then I'll be back to do the wet sponge and second coat process. Back in the job, we check my first coat. It's pretty dry. So now what I like to do is I take this wet sponge. There's not a lot of water on it, just like the previous videos. I like to get rid of this edge, and then I like to get the patch somewhat damp. And then we take the nice part of our knife and we just slick it out. We're just working the mud, working the mud. It's almost like working with ceramic clay. We're just working the mud, working the mud, working the mud. Sometimes you can go this way. You can go vertical, horizontal, diagonal, whatever it takes. And you can notice that we're just taking off the excess material. Taking off the excess material. And then I like to get rid of it, go over it one more time. Sometimes with this fiberglass you get little strings. You just pull them out. And then you just take your mud on your knife. So your first coat doesn't have to be pretty, because once you slick it out after, it starts to look really nice. So for a nice first coat, that's a nice first coat. Excess mud like that, I just take it off. You just be careful not to cut your hands. You can take it off your knife and just put it in your work area. Keep your tools clean. But now we're gonna go mix up another bucket or a pan of 5-minute and do a nice second coat. Out here mixing the second coat mud with the 5-minute mud, so we don't need as much mud. You probably use about half of your first coat. The first coat's the heavy coat. The second coat is a light coat. I like to keep my lids on my bucket, and it makes a good work stand. Plus, when we're mixing with the water, water doesn't fall in your bucket. If water falls in your bucket with their 5-minute, when you go to use it again, you get little clumps of rock hard drywall because of water droplets. So we always keep the lids on our bucket whenever we're not using materials. The same thing here. Let's start with a half a sponge of water, and we just toss and turn and get it all mixed in thoroughly. We always want to mix up our mud nice and creamy and make it nice and creamy. So second coat mud's a little thinner than the first coat mud because the first coat is a heavy coat. It's a coating mud. All the second coat is just basically a second pass through it to make it nice and pretty. This is 5 minutes, so we do work quickly. And like I said on this previous video about knives, you can see you got to be very careful when you do mix this because you are working with sharp knives and tools. So just take it easy. You're not in a rush. This is 5-minute mud. If you feel rushed using 5-minute mud, then you can always use a 20-minute mud or a 40-minute mud or even a 90-minute mud. And if you don't feel comfortable working with these quick set muds, you can always use a joint compound. A joint compound, you just put it on, let it dry overnight, turn around and sand it, and then repeat that process. But we like to use this quick set. So this mud's still kind of thick. It's nice, but I'm just going to put just a little bit more water because I want it just a little bit creamier. When it's nice and creamy, it just goes on like melted butter, and that's what we want here. We want a nice coat job. And you can see this is really creamy and nice. This is why I like to use this type of hot mud. But I got my 12-inch knife. You can see the bow in the knife, so that's the bow part. I like to put against the wall. The deep part goes on your fingers. So we just control our knives. You can do that way, that technique, but you're just steering the knife. Left, right. It's not center. You're not putting down pressure in the center. You're just holding the handle, but it's your fingers that control the knife. So I'm gonna go in there and we're gonna do a nice second coat on that patch. Get it back in here at the patch. It's looking real good just after the one coat. I could probably texture that and call it a day, but we're gonna put a nice heavy second coat. That way it's nice and straight and even with the wall. Since I went this way with the first coat, I'm gonna do my second coat the opposite way. This is not necessary, but it helps get rid of any waves and dips. See that technique I just did there? I put all my pressure on the right, and then I just hit the edge, and then you can follow through and meet back in the middle. So that's a good feathering technique. But those don't matter right now. Once you get better with knife control, then you can learn all those knife turns and twists and how to steer the knife. See, my coat has lap marks. That's fine. It's nice and heavy. It's covered because we're going to come through after it dries, and we're going to slick it out with the wet sponge just like we did the first coat. So we're just going to let that dry. It's easy with this 5-minute mud. You just want to make sure you get your tools cleaned up before it dries. With 5-minute, you do have to work quickly, so in and out, get your tools washed up, and set yourself up for the next step. That's all it is a step process. So we're looking good. That's the second coat. We're going to let that dry, and then we'll come back in to slick it out and get it ready for texture. Back in here in our second coat. It's starting to set up nicely. It's not fully dry. We want to catch it before it gets too hard so we can work with it and manipulate it. Our job here is just to put on enough materials to coat and fill in and feather out the area. So now I got it nice and damp. So now it's slick out nicely. Since my second coat, I want up and down vertical. I'm going to slick it out vertical first. So that will take off that excess mud. I like to get that excess. That's our job. We're just taking off the excess. We're not trying to build a hump on the wall. We're trying to feather it out to get rid of the hump they left. And then I like to always cross it off and go each way, each way, each way, each way. It's looking good there, but it still needs some help because it was a deep patch. So I'm actually going to mix a third coat of mud. Third coat of mud ain't going to be a lot of mud. It's just enough to do a nice tight skim to fill in the deep edge over there on the side. So we're going to fill it in with a third coat, and then it'll be ready for texture. The third coat, it doesn't really need it, but I want to do another pass on it. The third coat's just the same as the second coat mud. It's not too thick, not too thin. So I'm just basically going to just do this another pass through. This is just going to make the patch perfect. Basically, you want the patch before you texture. If I paint it right now, would it look like a perfectly smooth patch? Everybody always thinks texture will hide the badness, but texture is just a cosmetic part of the patch. You know, you get any deep spots like that, you just feather it out. But that's all we're doing, is we're just filling out the patch. This third coat is basically extra credit because we want that patch to be nice. But you seen that earlier, it was just a little small patch, and now it's basically turning into refinishing the whole belly band of the wall. So a little 2x2 patch is going to double in size once it's textured. But right now we're going to let that set, and then we just got to sponge it out real quick, and then we're going to come to and do the skip trowel texture. The skip trowel texture, you notice it's going sideways. You can see it's going that way. So we got to texture sideways, this way. Some textures go up and down. This skip trowel goes sideways, so sideways. Back at our patch, it's three coats put on it. It's nice and dry. I like to take the sponge and I kind of wipe past the patch area, so on the old wall it gets rid of any dust. So when I do texture it and feather it out, the texture doesn't like to bond to dust. So I like to take my work area out past the actual patch so the texture gets a nice bond. But we're going to go ahead with the texture. This is just a regular joint compound, and it's basically just a little thinner than second coat. See, it's not super nothing, it's staying on my knife. With the skip trowel, there's different methods. Some people do scoop, some people do dip. Scoop or dip. Either way works. When you do enough skip trowel, you can do either way. But this one, like I said on the last one, that it goes sideways, so I'm going to start over here on the existing texture. If you start on the existing, it kind of gives you the pattern. Everybody always asks, how do you do skip trowel? Well, it's one of the easiest textures to learn. Some people have struggled to learn it, but once you learn it, you love skip trowel because it makes your jobs easier. So I'm going to come all the way from this side. That way it blends in nicely. Skip trowel, skip it. So I like to bring it over here, feathered out, and I might just take it all the way to the corner bead. So that way you don't see a big patch on the wall. It'll be just nice and feathered in. We'll start over here in the angle and just come all the way over. Come all the way over. And the knife's just doing the work. I'm not pushing down or nothing. The knife is just skipping. It's just doing the work. I'm not pushing down hard. No muscle, nothing. The knife is just gliding over it. When your mud is mixed just right, just thick enough, just right, the Goldilocks of the muds, then it just does the work for you. Skip. Around detailed areas like this, they call it doing detail. So you just gotta go around it, put a little bit of skip on it. A little bit of skip. If you get light areas, you just put some skip there because we're going to have to knock it all down. Like I said, I like to go past the patch, that way it blends in. So we go up a little higher. I always take my patches out at least a foot or so beyond the patch area so you don't see a big patch on the wall. It blends it in nicely. Whenever you can, you go from angle to angle, corner bead to corner bead. It helps feather them all out, so it's a perfect match. And the texture here is kind of busy and kind of heavy, so usually you just do another layer of skip trowel. This is just a light layer. And basically this will make it all symmetrical because I'm just gliding over it. Now I'm done skip troweling. You could either knock it down this way or that way, but I'm going to start by just troweling it down. I'm not pushing down or nothing. The knife is just gliding over it. And this is basically a knockdown technique that you have to do on most skip trowels. If you don't do this, it's going to leave it really rough, and then you're going to have to sand it down to get rid of the rough ridges. But I troweled it down vertically, and now I'm just going to kind of trowel it down horizontally. So that way it's nice and even and nice. Nice skip trowel. And I always like to stand back and take a look at it and say, where does that look good? That looks good. Now let's put a little more here. And then we put it, just feather it out a little more. That makes it nice and perfect to blend in. Around the thermostat. But there you go, you got a nice skip troweled wall. We did 3 coats on it, so usually you only need 2 coats, so we went the extra mile on this one. Plus we feathered it out further and wider than most people would. Most guys would just do the patch, but I like to take it out nice and further, so you'll never know there was anything done there. So with this, you just have to let it dry overnight. And anytime tomorrow or thereafter, you can turn around and sand this area, primer and paint, but it looks good.